Well, thank you to David. And David, absolutely fascinating insight there. Clearly much more than just an estate agent, some really interesting data about mortgages and valuations. And I'm sure that might provoke some questions. But before we come to questions which have been coming in from the audience, and by the way, our second opinion poll is still running about what delegates think is likely to happen to house prices over the next 12 months. So if you haven't taken part in that yet, stay easy, please do. David, as I said at the outset, you pre-recorded your piece for us a few days ago. What is your reaction to what the Chancellor had to say yesterday?
Well, the stamp duty holiday is good news. It's meaningful support to the housing market. I'm pleased that it was with immediate effect to avoid any potential distortions to the market, and it's had an instant impact. To give you an example, yesterday and largely yesterday afternoon, on market appraisal requests, so this is people contacting us with a view to putting their house on the market, rose by 60% over the same level of the previous few days. So we're seeing an instant impact from that announcement, which is good news. I would like to have seen an announcement to extend the current Help to Buy scheme. I think that would have been very helpful, but who knows what might happen there. There's a £5,000 contribution to energy saving home improvements, which has largely gone unmentioned, but it does have an impact. And in our business, we've got Vibrant Energy, which is the largest provider of EPCs in the UK, so they'll be very busy. And finally, don't forget my half-price Mackie D's for all of August. Thank you.
Yes, I'm sure we're all going to be joining you at McDonald's. Of course, other chains do exist, David, but thank you very much indeed. So look, you touched on Help to Buy there, and I know David O'Leary from HBF is going to talk about this later, but we've had an interesting question in from Nick Scragg, who's in the audience today. And Nick asks you both, what do you expect is going to happen to house prices after the 31st of March next year? Are we approaching a cliff edge here? We have stamp duty threshold rising to £500,000, but until the 31st of March, we clearly have the existing Help to Buy scheme coming to an end on the 31st of March. Has the government built itself a potential problem for the second half of 2021 with the steps it's introduced at this point? Grianne, do you want to go first?
Hi there. Yes, there's definitely a feeling, because we have the mortgage holidays also coming to an end. So there's a lot of support just being taken away at the same time. So it's a really good point to raise. What we won't know is what the economy is doing at that point. So is the government support going to be enough to get us back up to that V-shaped recovery? And that is the purpose of what Rishi Sunak did yesterday, is to try and power the economy back to some level of normal operation. Can he do it by the end of Q1 2021? So for the housing market, that will be a crucial time, but we cannot rule out more government support. And also I fully expect that banks will be showing great forbearance in that time between now and then. So I'm not sure we'll get a complete cliff edge. Surely there will be some policy put in to sort of round it out.
David, in commenting on that, could you also just, another question that's come in, actually not named, is about the rental market, and I'll come back to Grianne on that in a second, but David, your thoughts first perhaps on next year, what's going to happen after the 31st of March, and secondly, are rental prices coming down, and what do you think the trend is on rental prices?
Well, to take that second question first, we're still seeing a lot of activity and a lot of interest on the rental side. It has fallen back. You may have seen from one of my graphs, it has fallen back from where we started immediately post-lockdown, but it's fallen back to levels that are still quite a bit higher than they were pre-lockdown. So I don't see a fall in rental values ahead. On the issue of the cliff edge, Q1 next year is going to be very busy. There'll be a lot of brought forward activity, and that probably does mean that Q2 is going to be relatively quiet. Whether that will be enough to have a measurable impact on house prices, hard to say at this stage.
And Grianne, what's your view on the rental market? And also a question that's coming from Richard Worth about what's happening in the trade down market, the older people's market, perhaps. Do we see, are there signs of that market being rekindled, do you think, or do you think the stamp duty cuts will help there? We're hearing at the moment perhaps that's the least active area of the market. Be interested in your views on that, but also on the rental market as well.
So our latest rental index for May shows that UK rents are going up by about 1.5%. Now, our rental index tends to be a bit of a bellwether for what the ONS index shows maybe 3 to 6 months later. So we can see it coming down from about 2.4 at the beginning of the year to 1.5. So we've definitely seen a slowing in rental growth, but we're still in a growth area. Regionally, the picture is quite mixed, however. In London, we've just seen a tiny dip in rents, just dipping into negative territory. A lot of that is to do with supply coming back to the market. There's been a bit of an impact from short lets moving to long lets, and that's boosting supply in some areas. But we've also seen really strong levels of demand at the same time. So on a national picture, the supply levels would suggest that they're not keeping up with demand, but there's some localized trends emerging in markets, which we're going to dig into much more for the end of the month when we update our index. In terms of people trading down, there's been demand right across the board in every price band, because we've broken it down when we started to see this rise in demand, just to check it wasn't clustered in one area. But what we're seeing is a broad-based rise in demand across all price bands, all regions. But yes, as you say, in terms of people who are looking, older people are perhaps less keen to come out, but in terms of what people are looking at across the country, it seems relatively broad-based. There hasn't been a sea change from what we saw a year ago or even at the beginning of the year.
Thank you, Grianne. David, do you want to comment on that?
Only to add, Stuart, that probably the retirement home builders are going to have a slightly more challenging time in terms of their customer base being able to just come out.
Yeah, I guess as indeed they've been having, in fairness, for some years, and because of the moribund nature of the second-hand market, which of course they very much depend on. Although I imagine their credentials are looking pretty good coming out of the coronavirus pandemic, because of course the retirement-style housing which we see in this country has actually done very well by comparison with care homes, and that might make older people perhaps think twice about where they want to spend their later years. David, we had a question from Stephen Brazier about down valuations. You talked in your piece about there not really being much of a change in the number of down valuations we're seeing post the crisis by comparison with pre the crisis. Obviously, that was a market whole sentiment. Is there anything happening in the new homes market which is different to the second-hand market on valuations?
No, not particularly. There is a slight difference in the figure that I gave you of 18% incidence of down valuations. We're looking at jobs done by our own chartered surveyors. We've got about 350, and those that we give to the valuations market, to the other chartered surveying firms on behalf of the lenders. There is a distinction there that where we give it out to the panel, the down valuation incidence is about 25%. So it's slightly higher with some firms than with others. And I can't give you a reason as to why that is, but no particular distinction between down valuations on new build versus second hand.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Let me just read you the results of the polls before we move on. Just the headlines coming from the poll results. Thank you very much to everybody who took part and voted. On transactions, the number of you who expect more transactions, quite an interesting result, this poll. More transactions, 32%. I have to say that's slightly higher than I would have anticipated. About the same, 26%. So the majority of you in the camp that it's going to be the same or higher, 42% lower. So that's interesting. I wonder whether that would have been the same result 24 hours ago. And on house prices, 13% of you think they may be higher. About the same, 53% of you think that, and the rest, 34% of you think they're going to be lower. So slightly more pessimistic on house prices than on transactions, and we'll be running more polls on planning very shortly, and I'm sure that will produce an avalanche of responses as well. So look, final question to Grianne and David, kind of a double-header question. I'm not going to ask you to commit to prices or anything like that because it would be unfair at this point, but do you think the Chancellor's going to be back in the autumn with more measures that are going to stimulate the housing market? Is that going to be necessary?
I think it's a bit of a wait and see game for the Chancellor now, because he's done stamp duty. It's an immediate change. So now he may wait and see how that goes over the summer. As we know, sometimes stamp duty holidays can be very effective over the whole period, but we get an absolute surge before they come to an end as well. But in terms of other areas of the housing market, he'll want to see if that network effect is picking up as much as he wants. Is he getting that feedback from the high street that people are out spending the money that he's saved them on stamp duty? And in terms of Help to Buy, we can't rule out that he makes further moves in that later in the year.
Grianne, thank you. And David, the final word to you.
This Chancellor has taken some stunning steps, ones which I don't think any of us quite expected. So I wouldn't expect to see too much more, with the exception of maybe something on Help to Buy.
Well, and we would certainly endorse and echo any extensions to Help to Buy, and we'll be coming back on that later. But first of all, it just remains for me to say a very warm thank you to both Grianne and David for taking so much time over the last few days to put the slides together, pre-record their presentations, and indeed appear live this morning and do their very best to answer the very interesting questions coming in from the delegates. And thank you to all of those of you who put questions in. I'm sorry that I couldn't get to every single one, but in the interest of time, I do need to move on.